I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the political economy of COVID with a couple of guests, one whose piece is the center of this discussion that I shared on Twitter the other day. Hopefully, if at least a couple of you got a chance to look at it in advance. And I'm talking about Professor Fabio Vighi, who, among other things, is a professor of critical theory and Italian at Cardiff University in the UK. His recent work includes critical theory and the crisis of contemporary capitalism, and Crisi de valore, Lacan and Marx. It looks like this is written in Italian, so he'll have to forgive me that I'm woefully mono plus a little bit lingual, so you know, I apologize for that. And we're also going to be joined again by Dr. Piers Robinson, who also, among many other things, is co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, of which I'm a member, and convener of the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda and Media, and associated researcher with the Working Group on Propaganda and the 9/11 Global War on Terror. Maybe we can work some of that in, given the anniversary just passed again. And he has served on the boards of several academic journals. Welcome again to you both. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, if I may, Fabio, if that's okay,
yeah.
I wanted to, if we could start with you, and I'm just sharing on the screen at least the title, so those who haven't seen it yet will get at least be clear where we're working from this morning. You've written this piece called "A Self-Fulfilling Prophecy: Systemic Collapse and Pandemic Simulation." So I wanted to just give you a chance, because I found the piece very compelling and fascinating, a little scary, and so on. But I thought we would at least start with your laying out the argument that you're presenting here, and then hopefully we can go through it a little bit for some more detail.
Thank you, Jared. I'll do what I can. I'll try to sum it up as best as I can. Basically, I'm looking at the context of the pandemic. I'm looking at potentially revealing some of the kind of background situation as was building up in the financial markets, particularly before the economy. So before 2020, before January 2020, basically. And I've discovered, no, I wasn't the first to discover them, but I've looked at some documents that were circulating around already in the summer of 2019, talking about a downturn, a looming financial downturn in the financial sector. And some of the actors, some of the people were talking, obviously very powerful entities. I'm talking about the BlackRock, particularly involved. I'm talking about obviously the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and I'm talking about the Bank of International Settlements, who were really the first to sound the alarm bells ringing in the summer of 2019. And basically what they were saying is that there was a downturn coming, and they were urging all these entities to take the necessary precautions to avoid collapse, fundamentally, right? So,
and if I can, I just want to highlight here is you have that in comparison to what happened in 2008, I actually like your line here that the belly of the financial industry is once again full of junk. That all of these things that some of us will, you know, even those of us who are not experts will remember just from
Sure.
The sound, you know,
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Well, the
collateralized
thing
loan
is,
obligation, all of that,
yeah,
they're all back again.
they're all back again, but you know, with a vengeance, almost on steroids. We're talking about from 2008. We're talking about an economy that was, you know, supported by quantitative easing, you know, constant, perpetual quantitative easing, and suddenly we have this alarm from the Bank of International Settlement saying, look, something is happening, something very bad is building up here, is brewing in the financial sector, and you've got to do something about it, quick, basically. That's what they're saying. Something is about to explode. And if you get an explosion of this magnitude in the financial sector now, particularly in the repo market, which is a particular sector of the financial industry, that will cause a disaster of immense proportions, not even comparable to 2008. After this alarm, you get, you know, BlackRock effectively in another document, white document, instructing the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of America, basically the U.S. Central Bank, to begin this extraordinary monetary intervention to plug the holes in this financial sector. So the financial sector really was moving towards a kind of what we now know was a liquidity trap. So all of a sudden we had an increase, a spike in the interest rates in the repo market, which caused the liquidity trap. And all of a sudden that was threatening as a kind of domino effect to affect all other sectors of the financial system. And from there, the contagion would have spread down on the ground, you know, what we call the real economy. So it would have affected absolutely everything and everybody. So hence the kind of the kind of urgency from all these entities to do something about it, right? So when this crisis actually materialized in exactly 2 years ago, incidentally, this is really good timing. Mid-September 2019, we get the repo market crisis, where interest rates all of a sudden go from 2% to 10.5%. That causes panic. Panic affects all other sectors, and effectively we have a liquidity trap, right? Which has potentially calamitous repercussions on everything, including our own bank accounts, right? So it really.
And can I just pause for a quick second, because admittedly this is
yes,
I try to follow this on a regular basis, and it's still sometimes I need a little repetition and
sorry,
slow of a pace. No, I appreciate it. I just want to, but just in terms of this issue here, if the way I've tried to simplify it in my own head with this repo issue that you're describing here, because we have talked about this in previous shows here a little bit, but is that the largest investment firms like BlackRock, like Vanguard, that you also mentioned in this piece, they are sort of backing the entire apparatus. Yeah. And so and if they aren't making their purchases at this certain pace or at a certain price or at a certain rate, you know, it starts to slow the circulation or the movement of the economy, and this is what starts to create this fear that you're describing here. Is that too much of an oversimplification? Is that at all correct or wrong? Or, you know, please elaborate. Correct me then.
Basically we're talking about the financial sector, and the financial sector, the repos, which stands for repurchase agreement, is a contract between financial operators and banks, which allows bank to get cheap money fundamentally, right? And this cheap money is then invested, is used for their own kind of speculations in other markets, including the derivatives market. So it's fundamental. And there's a lot of money in the repos, right? We're talking about probably close to $1 trillion being exchanged in repos every day normally. So there's a lot of money that we're talking about. And if something goes wrong there, then all other markets are affected in the financial industry, because there's simply no liquidity around anymore, and therefore what you get is potential deflagration really there, right? But what I want to emphasize is that has also a direct effect on our economy, what we look at when we think economy, right? Because we know we live in a debt economy, so everything depends on financing debts all the time. And if something goes wrong in the financial sector, it has huge repercussions down on the ground for us too, right? So in that sense, they had to do something about it to sort out that problem in the financial sector, because it was vital at a systemic level, I would say, right? And so we see already in mid-September 2019, the Fed executing BlackRock's instructions to print huge amounts of money and basically inject them directly into the financial sector,
which is the quantitative easing you were talking about.
Yeah, but it's it's a different kind of quantitative easing. They call it in their documents going direct. So directly giving them money to sustain the financial sector, and also some money, of course, but mainly to the financial sector, where basically they can continue to do what they do all the time. So speculate, right? And that sort of house of cards needed to stay up, because it's like a Jenga. You know what Jenga is, right? This game of Jenga. If you take one piece out, everything collapses.
Right.
And when I mean everything, I really mean everything, including every fragment of our own life is threatened by it now, because that's the state of the economy at the moment. Is our economy is dependent on the financial sectors to a degree that we can't even imagine, probably, right? So that rescue, that sort of, some people called it a bailout, again, a second bailout after 2008. And that's the key point for me, right? This is really the key point where we can make the connection between this and COVID and the health emergency as it then developed in 2020. In order to be able to sort out Wall Street fundamentally, right? In order to pump all this money, like huge amounts of money, I'm talking about billions of dollars on a weekly basis, pumped into the system, the real economy had to be turned off to some extent. So in order to save Wall Street, you need to turn off Main Street, because you cannot do that. You cannot put all that money into the system. This is money, incidentally, that's printed out of thin air, right? This is money that the central banks are simply creating with a few clicks of a mouse of a computer, adding a few zeros. That's it. This is the kind of money we're talking about now. So fictitious money, to use Marx's old terminology. So it's not money that is created in the cycles of capitalist cycles as we know them. So through labor, right? Profit made through the employment or exploitation of labor, depending on how you want to see it. This is money that is created out of nowhere, and it's all of a sudden it's pumped into the financial system. The moment this money begins to circulate quickly, also down on the ground, it creates, the risk is that it creates hyperinflation, right? The risk is that it creates runaway hyperinflation, and then we are in a Weimar kind of situation, like in the 20s in Germany, or Zimbabwe more recently, Argentina, where all of a sudden our money is worth nothing anymore. So we get a massive devaluation of our own wealth, and I think there's a connection between this, as it was taking place in the economy, specifically in the financial sector, and literally the turning off of the engine, the real economy that happened with COVID, because COVID exactly did that. Lockdowns, restrictions, the freezing of the real economy. My argument is that it's something that has to do with what was going on in Wall Street at the time. So the freezing of the real economy allows for the restructuring, we can call it like that, of the financial sector through these huge interventions, extraordinary, unheard of interventions in terms of monetary policy. So creating money out of nowhere to, and in fact, what we see after, after a crash, yes, in the markets, what we see now is it's Wall Street going up, being very healthy, and financial assets being inflated more and more. We can talk of it in terms of a bubble, various bubbles maybe being created, whilst Main Street is struggling hugely, right? So there's a massive separation between what's going on in Wall Street and what actually takes place in Main Street, down on the ground. And the wider context of this would be, for me, being aware of how the system that we call capitalism, that has become global in the last 20, 30 years, is imploding slowly but surely, right? We're looking at the implosion of the system, which is incapable of creating wealth through labor, fundamentally, right? And if you want to go a step further here, we need to look at a phenomenon called technological automation, I think, that has made sure that more labor is eliminated than reintegrated or reabsorbed into the market, simply because machines can do the same, even better than humans. But that's a kind of self-destructive narrative, because, of course, if machines, automation also means that less and less profits are created through labor. So capitals are not invested they don't sort of invest into labor any longer, but are driven towards the speculative markets, which are in this respect much more profitable for them, right? So we are looking at an economy which is, I think, slowly but surely approaching this moment of implosion, and is trying desperately to continue to operate, but in order to do that, it needs crisis, it needs emergencies, big emergencies, right? Like global emergencies like COVID. That allows it somehow to stay afloat, to continue, but at what price, right? My question would be, at what price? And the price seems to be that we need to move towards a more and more, I would call it, authoritarian type of regime, right? Where we need lockdowns, we need more forms of control, we need biopolitics, we need technology, technocracies, to make sure that our lives are controlled, so that that money circulates slower, or can be controlled, the circulation of money, and that allows for some sort of balance to be retained, right? But again, I'm not sure for how long we can continue like this, right? The balance is very fragile, and my view would be that we are moving towards the next bubble, the explosion of the next bubble, which really could be the equivalent of a kind of atomic explosion, really, because that could destroy.
So Piers, let me bring you in by sort of asking the question this way, which really didn't actually even occur to me until I was rereading your bio for the introduction. That if, for instance, if we wanted to, we could say, we don't have to get into any discussion or debate about the why or who even, but there seems to be a parallel here between COVID and 9/11 of an event occurs, whatever its origins, etc., is another discussion. But it is taken, or it is bent to a certain use. That event takes on a certain character, or is given a certain character, narrative, and used for a certain. And it seems in each case, if to the extent I'm understanding what I've read and what Fabio is saying here now, that Wall Street ends up on top again, and the most elite and the wealthy seem to make money off of all of these crises, whatever their origin. But let me let you respond to any of that, or what you've heard so far, or what your perspective is on what is happening right now.
Well, I think my perspective, coming from the angle of analyzing propaganda, I think what's become increasingly clear, and I think there were signs of it at the very beginning of the COVID event, of a lot of propaganda being used. And I'll talk about some of the details of that in a second. But just in terms of the overall lay of the land with this situation, I think it became apparent that a lot of propaganda is associated with COVID-19. This event, this crisis continues. We're 18 months in now. And it has all the hallmarks of what we see, what Peter Dale Scott described as you have a deep event occurring, which is then used by political elites, by political actors, in order to usher through major substantial changes. And I think, you know, the parallel with 9/11 is a good one to make. 9/11 was an event, and of course there's controversy. Ask Spike Lee about that. There's controversy about the event itself, but certainly we know now from documents and evidence which are in the public domain that 9/11 was an event that was used and exploited in order to usher in 20 years of regime change wars in the international system. And these regime change wars weren't really to do with fighting Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. They were to do with pursuing geostrategic objectives in the international system. So you had this major event, which was used as essentially a propaganda event in order to enable all of the wars that we saw, Afghanistan, Iraq, bleeding through into Syria and Libya, and obviously with Iran still as potentially an end goal of that regime change strategy. A deep event, an event which is used to mobilize support for wars which aren't to do with fighting terrorism, in the same way that COVID-19 has been, I think, propagandized in order to distract attention from very major political and economic restructuring which is going on. And I think in the grand scheme of things, that's what we now appear to be confronting us at this point in time. Just very briefly on just to sort of evidence this, I mean, it was very clear as somebody observing the COVID-19, the early days of the event, it was very clear that there was propaganda associated with this. The fear levels were being ramped up. And this was actually confirmed fairly early on by the release of SPI-B documents, a team of behavioral psychologists advising the government. And the documents actually referred to increasing people's personal sense of fear and threat in order to gain compliance with lockdown. And now, and this was occurring in Germany as well, and there's quite a large body of evidence showing that you did have an exaggeration, essentially, of the threat regarding COVID-19 going on. And at the same time as that, you actually had very early on the censoring and the smearing also of scientists, and some pretty eminent scientists who were questioning lockdown, questioning strategies such as zero COVID, questioning ideas that mass vaccination are the way to go. And that was sets off alarm bells that if you have eminent scientists, and these include people like Sunetra Gupta from Oxford, Martin Kulldorff, who I think is at Harvard, Bhakdi in Germany. If you have scientists actually being smeared and then also being censored, being, as it were, kicked off YouTube and so on, then this starts to look like something very different from a simple government reaction to a public health crisis. This seems to be the health crisis is being exaggerated in the same way with 9/11 and the threat of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism was used in order to mobilize support for the regime change wars. You've got an event with COVID-19 where you've got all the indicators that this is being hyped up and exaggerated. And then the question becomes, and I think this is the imperative for all of us now to start to engage with this now, is what are the underlying political and economic agendas which might or are going on under the cover of COVID-19 while everyone's sort of focusing on the virus and what to do with it and so on, arguing over lockdowns, vaccines, mandates, etc. You know, what are the actual economic and political drivers? And I think as Fabio has very convincingly and carefully described there, that there's a compelling argument that there's a major economic restructuring going on. And so I think Fabio will maybe go on to talk about some of the specifics as to where this might be leading. But I think
let me ask this,
that's what we're confronted with now, I think.
Let me just before I forget this point, I'll ask the both of you this, because you're talking about lockdowns being encouraged in parts of Europe, but here in the United States, the messaging seems more to be get vaccinated and get back to work, which some of us have understood to be the political economic argument in its stylings here. That even as pro-vaccination seems a little uncomfortably strong, but as someone who has taken the vaccine, who has at least welcomed comrades of mine in the medical field, in the profession, who work in these fields, who are arguing that we must get vaccinated. But even with that, even they were in agreement that this is being that while the vaccines are good and safe and necessary, they are being encouraged, and the drive behind that is to get us back to work, to get us out of a lockdown, to get the economy back going. But so are you saying that that is not what's happening here, or that there will be a shift in that here, or is that just another version of what you're saying is happening in parts of Europe, in terms of their encouraging a lockdown? And is the difference maybe because there's more of a safety net in these parts of in Europe that might support that, as opposed to here, or any of that, or any that I got wrong in there? Please.
I can maybe start. I don't know if that's okay.
Sure.
I just wanted to say, first of all, I don't think there's necessarily a consistent narrative here. You know, we have different positions, and some countries are pulling themselves out of this, or are doubtful, maybe more than other countries. We know the difference in Europe, for example. If you look at France and Italy at the moment, you can see that they're implementing pretty draconian measures, when other countries like Denmark, like Sweden particularly, they've never really done that. You know, so when it comes to lockdown, etc. So I wouldn't say that there's a uniform or univocal narrative here. There are differences in the way they've reacted to this, right? But at the same time, within that, I think that you can see a trajectory, a fairly clear trajectory. We've gone from the direct threats of the virus, obviously imposing lockdowns, to vaccination, and then variants. So what we get after vaccination is this variants which are preventing the return to, in economic terms, I don't know, normal interest rates, for example, right? Going back, everybody back to work. So they're keeping society with restrictions of sorts almost everywhere. So it's not as if they tell us, oh, we need to go back to normal, and we should believe that that's really what the aim is. Because what we see actually is variants taking over and forcing the same narrative, more or less, right? And then you see Jerome Powell of the Fed going to talk about all this, and talking about, everybody expects him to talk about tapering, the reduction of monetary stimulus, this huge monetary stimulus, but he doesn't talk about it. So he kicks the can down the road, and simply does not take any decision, because I think the argument is that he knows that we need both the virus in some sort of form, right, variants or whatever, and we need the restrictions to make sure that the two combine to work together. So the financial industry gets pumped up again, and on the other hand, we make sure that we keep an eye on inflation, for example, right, by making sure that the money doesn't circulate too quickly in the real economy. We know that inflation is already a problem, and it's probably going to surge again in 2022, and then it will become more of a problem. The more we go back to normal, the more we get inflation, and maybe hyperinflation at some point, right? Potentially, at least. So the more we can't afford to go back to normal, from their perspective, at least. We can't afford it, because that would cause massive turmoil in economic terms, with consequences that perhaps we cannot even think of.
This was if I remember correctly, this was part of the argument from Larry Summers and others at the earlier when they were saying this is why we can't have in this country the kind of safety nets that are given to other people in other parts of the world, almost everywhere, in terms of covering salaries and rents and mortgages, because that would, if I remember correctly, his argument was that would create the problem you're talking about, that it would in effect put too much money back into the economy too quickly or whatever. I never anyway, I always struggle to anyway, but Piers, go ahead. I think you wanted to jump in.
Well, yeah, just quickly, I think taking what you were saying, Jared, I think, again, stepping back and looking at sort of where the objectives which are being driven towards. I mean, if we think, if the aim is to gain greater control over the population, right, as Fabio was describing, we've had a process where you had lockdown as a form of control. And now it's not that lockdown is sort of coming to an end and it's going to be over. It's now being replaced with vaccine mandates. And there's clearly a push to get everybody vaccinated, even though there's, I'm sure, as you said, you've spoken to doctors who think everyone should get the vaccine, but there's plenty of eminent doctors who say that certainly shouldn't happen. There's certainly a drive towards that. But the drive, of course, towards vaccine mandates and vaccinating everybody is introducing just another form of potential control over the population. So you've had lockdown, now altering into mandated vaccinations. And I think, I mean, Fabio is probably better placed to talk about this now, but I think that raises this question of the vaccine mandate and the digital ID and the path towards digital currency and centralization of control effectively to central banks, which would come with a digital currency. And those are all mechanisms ultimately of control over populations. And so I see a continuity there really over the last 2 years, and it's all pushing in that same direction. Ultimately it's a very undemocratic, and some describe it as totalitarian, others as authoritarian, but it's certainly a dramatic reduction in people's autonomy in Western democracies.
So let me, because I know we are not the medical professionals here, and we're not getting into certain aspects of this debate, but in terms of these mandates, the one question that comes to my mind immediately, and Fabio in particular, this, and both of you, this issue of the digital currency that you write about is something that definitely caught my attention. I want us to get to in just a minute, but I want to ask this one more quick question here. Because there are those, myself included, whose initial response to that would be, well, what is the big deal to a certain extent of these vaccine mandates if, for instance, to travel, we already have vaccine mandates. We already have mandated shots that you have to get if you want to travel to certain places. We already have mandatory vaccines even here in this country if you want to send your children to schools. We already have, for those of us who have served in the military, you don't have you have a choice to leave the military and to potentially get put in the brig, but there are mandatory shots. There's vaccines that you get. So why all of a sudden would this one be? Why is there such a cause for concern over this one as opposed to those we already have in effect, some of which are international?
Well, what I'd say is that what it looks like to me, and this is, we're all sitting here, those of us who are starting to ask these deeper level questions, we're trying to sit here and what is exactly going on and so on. I think the picture is becoming clear, but we're still trying to work out exactly what is going on. But the issue with the vaccine mandates is it's not that we are being presented with this idea that you can all have a little paper card saying that you've been vaccinated and it pops into your passport and so on. That it's clearly being linked with a notion of digital ID. And that ultimately links through to the digital wallet, the digital currency. And we know the central banks are pushing for the digital currency. So what I think we have is that if we look at it from a kind of propaganda point of view, if you want to find a way, and this is me sort of hypothesizing here, but if you want to find a way of getting population to sign up to digital ID and ultimately to digital currency, and not face huge resistance from people saying, well, I don't want to have a digital ID, I don't want the government having that kind of access, you have a moral imperative, a medical crisis emergency, which, as it were, pushes people into complying or conceding the ground, say, yes, we'll have a digital ID, because we've got to get the vaccine mandate, we've got to get everybody vaccinated. And that creates, in a sense, the political and also the constituency to be able to bring through these major developments in terms of digital ID. So I suspect that's what this thing is being used for, or it's likely that's what this is being used for. It's to create this kind of propaganda drive, and this moral imperative to push this through, to get people to buy into having digital ID and so on.
But see,
and
but Fabio,
that's what it's driving.
Fabio, as you come to answer that and give your response, I mean, we're told all the time that digital currency, cryptocurrency, blockchain, all of this is super encrypted, super private, super safe, super good. People even deny it when I show them articles that say the biggest banks are now investing in all of this, because they're saying, no, this is what they're afraid of. It's going to overturn the world. And Spike Lee, to your point, Piers, who cut out his interview with engineers and architects for 9/11 Truth from his HBO series before the version came out publicly. He's promoting cryptocurrency and literally doing commercials telling everybody that this is the currency that unlike the previous currency, which enslaved us, is going to free us. So but you all are describing something a bit different, but please respond to anything else that
who knows, it might free us in a different context, in a different economic context, I would say. But in so if we step out of capitalism, which has its own rules, obviously, maybe in a different context it might even work to rethink the purpose of money itself, right? What is money for? But within capitalism, it's a great instrument to control everything, literally, what you spend, what you don't spend, and even to turn off your access to your own bank account if they want to. If you link it to a social credit system, if you don't behave, they can begin to turn off the tap. And all of a sudden you cannot do things that you thought you were always free to do.
Can't they do that now with your credit card or your bank? Can't they cut off your bank account, freeze your account?
I think there's an acceleration that is taking place if we adopt this digital identity. I think it's very similar to how Piers just described it. We go from vaccination, digital health passports. Once they're in, it's very difficult to come out. Once these have been approved, we are within a situation where we don't go back. We know very well they're going to stay. So once we got the digital health passports, there's a short step towards digital identity, and then let's say that there's a crash of the market. There's great, once again, fear, and they propose precisely this, that the only way to get us out of this problem is to implement this new digital currency, universal digital currency even, and they can give us back some money, for example. They can allow us access to money, but under their control, right? So they'll know exactly what we need to do with this money, and again, if we don't behave, if we don't do what we're supposed to do, then they can simply shut it all off. So in that sense, if you look at that continuity, there's certainly a kind of totalitarian threat, I think, ahead, and I mean, we should at least question that narrative, right? I think the least we can do is to raise awareness about that possibility. Whether it will materialize or not, I'm not so sure, right? It depends also on how ready we are to resist it. And it's not necessarily going to be easy for anybody to impose it. I'm very well aware of that. But we know that in the face of a crisis, a huge crisis, we tend to accept what we're told to do, right? We do exactly what we're told to do because fear is the driver, right, in this respect. So once we're scared, we will sleepwalk into anything without questioning it. So I think we're looking at a series of events recently where the crisis is become larger and larger. And if there's a mega deflagration in the financial sector that threatens to wipe out all our savings, or, you know, and so on and so forth, then we will take even draconian measures like, for example, the one we just talked about, right? So I think the fundamental thing is to be aware that there is this going on in the background, and there is, I think, an acceleration towards a kind of authoritarian capitalism, which is in itself very scary, because it gives very few people the possibility of controlling all the rest, fundamentally, through digital technology, which clearly is moving very, very fast too.
Yeah, I mean, I've just come in there. I mean, the digital currency, I mean, the issue in relation to that, I mean, there's a variety of sort of ideas for digital currency out there, but I think the issue here is this idea of this digital currency and linking to the central banks and the concentration of power to those entities. And that's the big problem here. There are other sort of, I think there are other ideas about, you know, cryptocurrency and so on, which could possibly be free of that and so on, but that's not the drive coming from the central banks and so on. I think, you know, China, this point about everyone needing to, as it were, get up to speed, as we've all had to get up to speed with basic epidemiology and virology in the last year, getting up to speed with the where this might go in economic and political terms if these things emerge, which are, I can't emphasize enough, being pushed for by many of the same entities which are really pushing the COVID-19 agenda. Where this might end up, I mean, China, obviously, the social credit system, the potential to punish people effectively for saying things which go against the government, for example, that becomes much easier for governments to do that. The idea that, and I think if you listen to Tony Blair, what one could be forgiven for thinking that sort of we can have digital ID and digital passports for vaccines and so on, and there'll be lots of protections all built in, and we don't have to be fearful of the government and so on. I think that is a profoundly, as a big error to say we trust our governments with that amount of power. I mentioned Tony Blair for a reason. We know that he was not telling the truth after 9/11, and we've got the documents to prove it, and so on. That these people, powerful governments, cannot be trusted with that level of information and control over people. And in the most basic kind of sort of coming from a point of view of enlightenment, democratic thinking, you know, we have democracy to, one of the key reasons is to protect people against overbearing state, to protect people against corruption and so on, and exploitation. And, you know, if we remove our ability to properly challenge the powers that be, which potentially this kind of information handing over to the government and allowing them to control all these things, would profoundly undermine our ability as people, as sovereign people, to actually hold our governments to account. So I think in just terms of basic sort of, you know, democratic principles, this is a very dangerous road to go down, and we shouldn't be trusting. We shouldn't be trusting governments in the West who have pursued multiple wars in the international system with horrendous loss of life over the last 20 years. Are we going to trust those same people, such as Tony Blair, who's now saying you will need a digital ID? I think it's naive. I'm not saying you're naive. I think it's naive for any of us in the extreme to think that's a safe thing for us to do. And hey,
look, I might be naive. You know, I study this stuff. I work very hard on this stuff, but I'm you know, by no means impervious to all of the various messaging. So I'm at least open to I don't know, logically reasonable researched arguments. So that's more or less, which, by the way, as I said to you off air, my biggest argument, my biggest problem with all of this stuff, whether it's COVID or 9/11 or anything, is the methodology put to various conclusions. So if my own is lacking, I don't mind that being checked. But just very quickly, I wanted to, you've both touched on this. I wanted to make sure to ask specifically about the sort of the consequences of this kind of research and argument that you're both either engaged in directly or referring to. You've even mentioned some of the censorship and whatnot. But could you both talk a little bit about the consequences of this kind of research or these kinds of questions that you all are raising? Because that is something that is a particular concern for me. Censorship, threats, overemployment, etc. Just for people raising certain questions or pointing to certain research, even if I disagree with it, I don't think there should be censorship and threats of loss of employment. But anyway, could you both talk a little bit about any of that?
Oh yeah, my experience of that, I don't have any yet. Maybe I should say personal experience about this. I'm hoping to stay away from any kind of censorship. I'm working at university, and I want to believe that it's a place for critical debate, right? So you can have different opinions, etc. But what I see, for example, in Italy, my country, right, there's a lot of demonizing going on of people who simply don't accept the official line. In Italy, we have a term, strategy of tension, right, which harks back to the 1970s, creating chaos, creating tension to try and implement more authoritarian measures. This is something that all historians know about, right? This took place in Italy, in Europe, anywhere else, in other parts of the world. But Italy was almost like the perfect place for that to be executed, almost like a, I know that I think something similar is taking place now. Censorship is doing well at the moment in Italy, right? You're not really allowed to discuss these issues openly, certainly not in mainstream media. And of course, the threat of losing your job and source of livelihood is real. Is real, and it shuts people up. It prevents people from even discussing certain things. So we're not talking about something hypothetical. We're talking about something that is already real. And let's say that we get another wave. Probably there's going to be another wave in the autumn and winter, and more fear, more deaths, and they've got a perfect scapegoat there already. The non-vaccinated, for example, are the perfect scapegoat for everything here, and they are even the terms that are used are extremely demonizing. If you think of Italy, for example, they call no-vaxxers, probably here too, right? Probably in the States too, and no-vaxxers, and they are they've been associated by a prime minister, Mario Draghi, to assassini. That's the word he used, right? Killers, assassins, people who want to kill other people or are going to kill other people one way or another. And that has created a very ugly climate in the media. The language, you can't even imagine the kind of language that they use to describe those who raise doubts. Fathers, mothers, families who simply want to know, want a bit more clarity on vaccines and effects of vaccines, because it's not clear. It's simply not clear. If I take a vaccine against yellow fever, I know that for 10 years I'll be fine. It's a proper. It works. I can go where I want to go. But here we're talking about, after 5 months, a second dose, a third dose. In Israel, it's a fourth dose already. Boosters everywhere. It's inevitable that there are questions and doubts. And what I find particularly telling is that all public debates around these issues are not allowed, right? So we don't see in mainstream media any public debate there is simply demonizing of those who don't agree with the official line, and that in itself is telling, is a symptom that something is deeply wrong with the way we're dealing with this, right? I think it's impossible not to see it. It's almost intuitive, right? If you eliminate debate, public debate, then you're certainly doing something. You know, you don't have a clean conscience. I would say.
And I do have to. There is. I agree with just about everything you just said. There is, at least my experience in this country, there is a sort of opposing force from below, so to speak, that is also, I think, inflamed and encouraged from the similar presentation of these discussions, or lack of presentation of these discussions. In other words, that this from below we get this: if you are pro-vaccine, you are a dupe, you are naive, you are pro-state, you are pro you're participating in your own self-destruction and that of your community. So which for me is included in the array of problems in having these discussions and debates, which is again why for me the method brought to bear from either side is perhaps the biggest problem, because either we're getting you're an anti-vaxxer and a Trump and a reactionary whatever, right, or you're a pro-vaccine dupe of the state, tantamount to an infiltrator agent participating in your own destruction. And
so
anyway,
what's suspect is the polarization, right? The polarization is really suspect, and so who's driving this polarization? We need to ask these questions, right? Why do they want us so polarized and fighting each other? This horizontal war almost, right? Pro-vax, no-vax. I mean, these are categories that have been created very much by the media, like that of conspiracy theorists, like conspiracy theorists. There's another one that it's been invented a while ago and it's proliferating, but it's got a specific purpose, right? To create conflict, to create opposition, and very often ugly opposition, so that maybe you can blame somebody for doing something really wrong at one point, and in the meantime implement certain measures which are, they wouldn't be able to get through without this, once again, emergency situations.
By the way, just in case anybody, I don't want to be misunderstood. When I mentioned abortion and gay rights on this list, I'm speaking specifically to what, folks like Karl Rove and others have said in this country quite explicitly, that they chose to create these as wedge issues to divide the electorate. And it was not for a real concern about abortion or gay rights. So I'm not judging anybody's. I just want to make sure I clarify that. Piers, did you want to say anything, add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, just it is from what I've looked at, it's very clear that you've had that it's not a level playing field, and it hasn't been a level playing field for the scientists. And this is getting away from sort of, as it were, the debate out there amongst the public. But the scientists, has not been a level playing field. So you've had the scientists who've been questioning the lockdown and the vaccines and so on, have been smeared and censored. They're the ones who are getting closed down, and the mainstream media are deferring to the scientists who are promoting the agenda. And we've had, someone like Sunetra Gupta from Oxford, who's sort of a critic of lockdown and so on, but doesn't talk about any of the political economy and so on. She was being smeared as a conspiracy theorist in the British media. Bhakti, the German epidemiologist, was smeared, and linked with allegations of anti-Semitism and so on. And so you see all of these tools of censoring and controlling, which I've experienced myself in terms of speaking about the war in Syria, seeing it being applied in COVID-19. So it's very clear, I think, that at the scientific level, that the playing field is not level. And it doesn't take. You can go and look at the work of groups such as HART in the UK, HART, or Pandata, and these two organisations represent professionals and scientists, all of whom are asking some pretty tough questions. And both of those organisations, from what I understand, have got a long list of examples where people have been censored, academic papers have been pulled, suppressed. My understanding is that Robert Malone had a special section of the Frontiers Journal pulled, is my understanding from him, questioning some aspects of the COVID-19 response. So you've had this kind of smearing and censoring of scientific debate, which can only be a bad thing and actually works against, or it encourages what you've just been describing, this kind of polarization and so on. But it's being, I think it's coming really from the top down. The people pushing and driving the COVID agenda are sort of closing down those avenues for reasonable, sensible discussion about what should be done.
All right. Well, the only other question I had, and then feel free to make any points that I haven't invited you to, and then we can wrap. But one question that I did have, I guess, Fabio, this is more directed for you at the moment, at least, is that when you were doing your research for this, and you're talking about, or just in general, talking about BlackRock and Vanguard. Have you ever, because for a while I used to look into Vanguard because it's the dominant institutional investor in almost everything, and certainly in our media environment and beyond here in the U.S. I don't know all that it's into, but when I tried to look up who are the members of Vanguard or the owners of Vanguard, the website, for instance, I remember at one point literally said the owners of Vanguard are the investors in Vanguard, and if you didn't have a login, that was as much as you got. So there was no. So I was just curious in terms of if you've ever seen beyond the veil, beyond what I've been able to see, like who's actually in this organization. I don't even. I couldn't tell you one name.
Well, obviously the figure that I think everybody would mention here is Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, and he's very much connected with politics. We know that he's a Democrat, and he's connected with the Biden administration very strongly. But it's all interconnected. It's difficult to distinguish between political and economic dimensions anymore, right? Because
right.
It's unfortunately we're driven by this type of economy that controls most institutions in various ways. Sometimes some people can say nice ways as well. They can do some good things. There's a lot of as you know, philanthropists around that do great things, but nevertheless control institutions quite literally. They tell them what to do, how to act, and so on. I have no doubt that these people, I mean, if you look at the giant three, Vanguard, especially by BlackRock and State Street, they control they manage about half of the world GDP, right? So imagine the kind of power that you have when you move so much money. And of course, they control maybe 80 or 90% of stock markets. They have huge power, and it's naive to think that they don't know what's going on. I think it's naive to think that they've been taken by surprise by this.
Well, I mean, your article suggests that that's not possible.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible. We need to think about something which is so large and so powerful. I'm not sure. I don't think they got all the answers either. Right? Very often they proceed very tentatively themselves. We should also abandon this notion that they decide everything. They will decide our future forever. They are. I mean, their narrative is full of cracks. We were talking about it earlier. It's full of contradictions, and these contradictions are more and more obvious. And they don't have the magic wand to simply, make everything work in their favor necessarily. So I think we are, in that respect, within a kind of war, not traditional war, but some kind of asymmetric psychological war. And obviously there is a bit of a disproportion in terms of who's got the power and who doesn't.
Well, they're more organized and more well-resourced, but they're not some
they're not infallible and invincible, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
So I think there's hope in that respect. There's always
absolutely.
I think it's a mistake to project this notion of invincibility onto the other. In this case, the big power, the big elites, etc. they're not invincible, and often I would say they're even conflictual amongst themselves. They're different kinds of, they want different things, not necessarily the same thing. They're not necessarily, so that gives us hope.
Right.
Because contradictions will emerge and will allow people to realize that something is wrong, and try to build maybe different narratives, a different idea of society, a different idea of how we should live together, rather than being hostage to these forces. So I'm not a complete pessimist, in that respect.
No, I fully agree with you on that. It's yeah. Anyway, Piers, did you want to add any, I guess, concluding or wrapping up comments for now?
Just briefly picking up what you've both been talking about. I mean, if COVID-19 is an opportunity for elite groups to change the financial system, reduce our levels of democracy down to zero, which I think it clearly is, it's also an opportunity with what they are doing and the amount of resistance that there is globally. And there is a lot of resistance in mass protests and so on, a lot of groups forming, new political parties forming. There's an opportunity in this for us to do exactly what Fabio has just been saying, for people to become aware, to develop a better understanding of the power structures, and then to work to change them, to bring in greater democracy, a more egalitarian society, and so on. So this is a possibility for, as it were, us, the people, to actually start to address some of the problems that all three of us have known and taught and researched about for years, about problems with our democratic systems, our media, our academia, and so on. These are all potentially can be opened up, and these problems can be addressed, I think. But it does require, I think, essentially people to stop the focus on COVID-19 and start to understand the political economy that's going on behind the scenes, and to then act in whatever way people feel that they can, whether it's joining a party, a group, just becoming better informed, etc., whatever, in order to try and build a kind of political center of gravity to push back against this, and to hopefully end what I see as a descent, which is not particularly slow. I think it's pretty rapid at this point, descent into a profoundly authoritarian or worse societies across the West.
I appreciate that. I fully agree that we just we have to get more active and involved and organized. And but I'm sorry to come back to this, but I did just look at something here. So did I hear you correctly, Fabio? Because someone also mentioned it in the chat. Are you saying that is Vanguard a part of BlackRock?
No. The separate entities.
No, they're
right?
separate. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'm talking about, these are the big three, right? I mean, these are the most powerful ones. The control the most, the manage the most funds and the most money. But I mean, they're interconnected. Of course they are. I mean, no, they're all interconnected, but they are separate entities within this massive galaxy. We need to think of a galaxy that is connected with everything, that we do. And
no, that's what I'm saying. Every time I look up a company or anything, Vanguard is involved, or BlackRock. But for a time, it was just seemed like Vanguard. And just very quickly, and I won't keep. I'll leave it here for now. But and this one thing I'm reading, it says, quote, "It doesn't matter whether it's Vanguard, BlackRock, Fidelity, or the California Public Employees Retirement System. If 2 or 3 investors control 20 to 40% of the vote of every U.S. company, shareholder democracy will not work as intended," end quote. Between them, the big five manage $27.7 trillion in client assets globally and administer over $34 trillion in U.S. equities alone. The grouping manages 15 trillion, or 61.89% of all assets held in the U.S. equity funds. That's just tremendous, and that's just one quick sentence I'm reading there. So anyway, yeah, that's a problem. Anyway, thank you both very much. I really appreciate you coming on, and I would like to continue this discussion on and off line as we go forward at some point again. But thank you again to the both of you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks, Jared.
All right. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.